So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what we've been doing in Washington. Julian and Susan and James talked a lot about, and Susan explained how the industry, the operators, are going forward with implementing the recommended practices for the operators. I'm going to talk to you about how the recommended practices for the local governments are being adopted by a variety of groups, a variety of local governments in Washington. But before I get there, I want to talk about what groundwork was laid for the implementation of PIPA recommendations before it was PIPA. In 2000, right after the Bellingham explosion, the governor appointed a citizens committee on pipeline safety. And so at the state level, with the assistance of the UTC, the groundwork was starting to be laid for additional outreach to various aspects of the state. In 2004 to 2006, there was a series of workshops across the state with local government officials, planners, and industry to explore ways to improve land use planning around pipelines. In 2006, and this is, as you know, 4 years before the PIPA report was out. In 2006, a cooperative report was issued by the Trust and UTC and the Municipal Research Services Council Center, which is a nonprofit in Washington. It's kind of unusual. It serves much the same function as the NACO technical staff does, but for all of the local governments in Washington. They can call with any sort of question about employee relations or pipeline planning or financing or whatever, and they provide free services to local governments for all sorts of reasons. So that report was issued and made available to the local governments across Washington. The MRSC also established a web page, and because so many local governments regularly use the MRSC web page for a variety of other things, that started improving the visibility of PIPA-like practices and sample ordinances and a couple of early adopter ordinances. The UTC provides GIS map layers to local governments, separate and apart from the mapping system that's available on the UTC website and the NPMS. In 2009, the Trust was awarded a TAG grant and used that to try and identify what some of the barriers were to local governments in taking on adopting these recommended practices. So Carl and MRSC worked to find out what it was going to take to make the PIPA practices compelling. And what they found was a series of things. They used surveys and focus groups and interviews and identified the barriers and what planning staff needed. And I'll just take a step back, and the crash that Julie showed in permit applications also is probably reflected in the similar line on planning staff numbers. Many local planning staffs are actually funded by permit fees, and when permits crash, staff goes away. So it becomes more difficult to make your case compelling for them to take on anything new. So what this research found from the first TAG grant was what information the planners needed, who they wanted to have deliver it. They wanted a reliable messenger, as it were, and the answer to that was the MRSC, UTC, and the Association of Washington Cities, which was, for the majority of respondents, another organization that they were familiar with and would trust a message coming from them. Where they usually obtain their information about planning and new planning initiatives, what other barriers they saw in developing a consultation zone ordinance, and those turned out to be, not surprisingly, money and politics. What incentives they thought would be helpful, and again, it's money and politics. They thought that small grants would be helpful to defray the cost of additional staff time to take on a new initiative, and they were very interested in having technical assistance in going forward with a new initiative. So fast forwarding another year, the Association of Washington Cities last year was awarded a TAG grant, and under that grant, in coordination with the UTC, again the MRSC and the Trust, an implementation plan was put forward trying to establish a framework that could be replicated so that local governments, we could make the initiative to local governments and try to increase adoption of the recommended practices. Carl and Jim Doherty with the Municipal Research Service Center made a number of road shows around the state with a variety of cities. Carl appeared at the NACO and APA meetings in the region, and they've made numerous presentations to cities and counties upon request. As also part of that grant, AWC set a chunk of it aside that was used for mini grants that we then distributed to cities and counties that were interested to, and these were $3,000, we're talking mini grants, to help defray the cost of staff time in putting together a consultation zone ordinance. We also sent out many notifications of the availability of those grants, and tried to make that case as compelling as we could. Even in spite of that effort and the outreach that had already happened, we were only successful in hooking 5 cities to apply for and be awarded these grants. They range in size from 800 people in the city of Roy to Kirkland and Bellingham, which are much larger cities. The 5 of them are currently in a variety of stages of preparing and adopting ordinances. They are looking at things like requiring the pipelines to be included on plats, and excuse me, I'm going to need some water. Implementing many of the local government recommended practices in the PIPA report, including mapping and so forth, up to the consultation zone, which is a concept, just briefly, that essentially requires a developer to communicate in some way with the operator before they get a building permit. Skagit County, which is another county in Northwest Washington, received its own TAG grant in the same year, and they've been working on a pipeline safety ordinance. And just to sort of give you a taste of the difficulty of the politics involved, which you might not think would be that difficult, but the planning staff proposed an ordinance in which they suggested that the Planning Commission might think about setbacks from transmission lines. And the property owners came out of the woodwork, and they packed the Planning Commission meetings every time the subject was on the agenda. The Planning Commission, not surprisingly, withdrew that proposal, even though it really was just a proposal and there was not a specific setback indicated in there. But they are still struggling with the aftermath of that initial effort, and the commission is trying to salvage an effort out of that to actually retain things like the consultation zone and limiting development of high consequence difficult to evacuate populations near the pipelines, but the setback issue is the third rail, if you will, of talking about these issues, and so it's likely to affect how other local governments in the area start thinking about it. There are 3 other counties and 2 cities in Washington that currently have a variety of pipeline safety ordinances, some of them including consultation, some of them including additional setbacks, some limiting high consequence, hard to evacuate building near pipelines. So I think in some respects the right thing is happening. The cities are educating themselves and making their ordinances their own. Lessons learned, the background work that led up to the PIPA report implementation, excuse me, PIPA report implementation and the recent TAG grant to the trust was really essential to find out what the planners thought the barriers were, how to overcome those barriers, and to identify a local champion for a pipeline ordinance. As Julie said, there are tens of thousands of local governments, and it's important for a planning commission and a planning staff to have a local elected official, preferably a planning commissioner if not, who's interested and who is going to carry this, because planning staffs will find it very difficult to overcome any political opposition if there's not a local champion. One other thing that's been very helpful, the UTC worked with the trust and with the operators in the state to identify a single person within each operator for local governments to contact, so that they have that contact information as they're going forward to deal with their operators. It cuts off much of the 3-step conversations within the operators. And finally, the money. And $3,000 was apparently not enough to hook in many more cities. Planning staffs are incredibly strapped and understaffed, so taking on an additional initiative about which they know very little going in is going to be a big challenge. So part of the challenge of the PIPA team has been to try and figure out how to get these tens of thousands of local governments interested. And what we found in Washington is that it's hard, and trying to do it without money and with very little staff is going to continue to be a challenge. We were unable to get to give away even the whole pot of money that we had available from the existing TAG grant. And so I'm leaving a question as to whether aiming at individual local governments one by one, marching through tens of thousands, is going to be a model that is able to be scaled up nationwide. It almost has to be that way in order to get things like consultation zone ordinances adopted. But I'm not sure, short of a massive influx of money and good intent on the part of all of the stakeholders, that's going to get us there. So we are rethinking our plan, and as of yet, we're still trying to meet that challenge, but that's where we are right now. So part of our panel has had to leave to meet their planes, but if you have questions for the remaining 2, we'd be happy to take them. Yeah.
Have you had help from operators in trying to move these local governments?
Repeat the question.
The question was whether we had help from the operators in trying to reach the local governments. They have not taken an initiative to try and talk their local governments into adopting anything. Once local governments have indicated any interest, the operators have been forthcoming and have attended open houses with planning staff, have attended planning commission meetings and so forth. So once the local government has indicated an interest, they've been very helpful.
I want to mention that we do have a lot of PIPA members here that worked on the project. I can see, including Carl here and John Jacoby and Dave Johnson and others. I've followed this as a PIPA member for a long time, and one of the things that's come up, and we saw this in Washington State where we had a county that really resisted and kind of fell apart on PIPA. Does PIPA have the flexibility to allow the operator to have much more direct contact with the landowner and sometimes completely avoiding local government or the planning department? Is that something we have thought about?
I think those conversations certainly could happen outside the context of a development application, and the developer could certainly approach the operator directly. The goal, I think, of the recommendation is to ensure that that happens, and so encourage the local government essentially to require it as a condition of permitting, just so that there's a uniform trigger and some assurance that that conversation takes place. But certainly it could take place without that. It's just that in many places a developer simply wouldn't think of it, and in others they would actively avoid it.
Any other questions? I found it quite easy. All I had to do was run for election, get 51% of the vote, and get in office, write an ordinance, and get it passed, and it was done. So, you know, if you do that over 10,000 jurisdictions, we're good to go.
It strikes me that with the challenges that you've faced, and you've really explained them great here, and I appreciate that, perhaps there needs to be, over the next couple years, maybe an intensive education effort at the different levels of planning associations, maybe educational organizations that are teaching land planning, like a really full court press on PIPA, you know, the principles of that, right, with the idea that in the longer term, those audiences become more receptive to consultation zones and so on.
Right. And some of that effort did occur in Washington. Carl did speak at the planning directors meeting, which is an annual meeting, and has spoken at regional meetings of the APA. That is actually one of the tacks that the communication team is thinking about taking, is aiming at the APA on the national level, the American Planning Association, at the national level, to try to encourage their participation rather than the trust or someone bringing it to them, trying to get it instilled at the national level so that it does become a regular part of their curriculum. That still will somewhat beg the question of the almost personal attention that is needed to get each local government to move. Carol?
In the context of reauthorization and discussions about funding, and I recognize this is not the best time in the world for this idea, but is it possible to have a supplemental amount of funding provided to the states if the state pipeline safety entity, whichever that may be, will take on some kind of initiative within the state? Because sometimes if that message is coming from within the state, you know, as a attachment for more federal funding, sometimes that will, you know, sort of grease the skids to make things happen.
It's not something we've talked about. Well, we've talked about PIPA implementation as part of reauthorization efforts. It hasn't made it into any of the bills. I guess, Dave, you're the only state regulator I know in the room, so if you want to take a shot at answering whether you'd be willing to take that on if the funding were available, that'd be interesting.
Carl and I have talked about that in the past to see if we can assist in that funding. I do have quite a large piggy bank with a significant amount of civil penalty dollars in it. Trying to get to that's a bit of a challenge, though, with the way things are. But it's certainly on the table. We've even gone to PHMSA to inquire about possibly using some of our grant funding. I've talked to Zach Barrett, and that's something that you folks, Linda, maybe can talk about. But they are possibly considering. I won't speak for them, but I think it's a good use of resources, particularly for us. We've seen some movement where some of these local governments have said, give us a little bit of money and we can start acting on this. If we can boost that level of grant funding, I think it's very doable. So we're willing, our program's willing to invest in that program, and so hopefully we can, bring that onto a larger scale. But certainly something to consider anyway.
Can you hand the mic to Commissioner Florio, and I'm going to put him on the spot and ask him the same thing?
Well, considering I just became aware of this in the last hour, I'm not in a position to make a commitment, but it seems like a very good idea to use the attention we have in California right now to try to launch something like this. And we've, like everywhere else, there's not a lot of new development going on, but there certainly could be part of a local awareness initiative to push on this. So I'm going to take it back to our folks and see what we can do.
Great.
Not on behalf of the agency, but on behalf of the CATS program, we're all very much involved in this, and we certainly work with our state partners on a day-to-day basis. And our state partners have very limited resources, and they're certainly not at all shy about using this to try and promote that communication in terms of whether it's officially reimbursable. We have a state programs group, and that would be a matter of negotiation between the state programs group and each individual state. But I speaking as an individual, I'd be very surprised if PHMSA would do anything other than encourage that.
Anything else? All right. Thanks.